The Far East saw some of the bloodiest fighting and most appalling atrocities of the Second World War. Millions died, but one young man came through the lot. He somehow survived a combination of catastrophes unlike any other. Torture and disease in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, torpedo and shipwreck, and the Nagasaki atom bomb. Each of these killed tens of thousands, but he survived them all. His name? Alistair Urquhart, and he's still with us today. The authorities forbade Alistair to talk about his war. For decades he was silent. His wife died without ever knowing.
You felt really forgotten. We were the forgotten army.
But now, for the first time on television, he'll tell his story.
There were men shouting, screaming, calling for their wives, calling for their children.
A tale of unimaginable resilience and willpower.
It was determined that they weren't going to win.
The story of a man who simply refused to die. Every week, Alistair Urquhart goes to the tea dance at his local village hall. At 92, his foxtrot can still sweep any woman off her feet.
When I'm dancing, I'm in a different world. So I say to myself, I'm pretty good at doing a quick swerve or a different step. I enjoy every dance.
It's a world far, far away from the hell he went through nearly 70 years ago. Alistair did not have what you might call a good war. And only recently has he felt able to revisit it. At first, he could only write his memories down. But now, for the first time, he'll speak openly about those terrible years.
It suddenly flashes through my mind. Wait a minute, how did you get out of that one?
The tale starts in November 1939. Recruits signed up in droves, hoping for adventure and a chance to do their bit. 19-year-old Alistair got an exotic posting to Singapore, 6,000 miles away, to help defend this outpost of the British Empire from invasion. For a lad who'd barely been out of Aberdeen, it was like being sent to Mars.
The thing that struck me most was the smell that came from the cooking utensils and the Chinese men sitting playing mahjong, and the clatter of the mahjong was amazing, and it was so different.
When war broke out in 1939, Japan allied itself to Germany and embarked on a massive land grab. In its sights, British colonies in the region, including the prized strategic base of Singapore. British propaganda did its best to play down the Japanese threat.
The idea the British tried to put across was that the Japanese eyesight was poor, they all wore glasses, and they were small, and they would not be fighters at all.
The speed and efficiency of the Japanese advance soon gave the lie to that. On the 7th of December 1941, they attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. 2,500 were killed. Meanwhile, they launched a devastating offensive in the Malayan Peninsula. They were highly skilled jungle fighters, ruthless and well-trained. The British were unable to offer much more than a token resistance.
They virtually just overran our people, right, left and centre, right down to Singapore.
The entire operation took less than 2 months. By the beginning of February 1942, the Japanese were on the outskirts of Singapore. The British garrison was outgunned, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. On the 15th of February, Singapore fell.
eventually the British gave in and surrendered in what was the greatest capitulation in terms of numbers ever suffered by Britain in any war. Over 100,000 British and Empire Australian and Indian troops. And it was a very, very humiliating defeat.
Those who could fled, but defending troops like Alistair stayed to the last. They were rounded up by their captors and grimly awaited their fate.
As we stood there, in the blazing sun, without food, water or shelter, the horrible reality broke over me in sickening, depressing waves. I was part of Britain's greatest ever military disaster. I was a prisoner. It was a gut-wrenching realization that my liberty was gone. This was the worst moment of my life.
50,000 men, Alistair included, were herded into the barracks at Changi, built to accommodate no more than 800. Some were as young as 19.
That was the start of Japanese incarceration. This sheer hell, really.
What is common to all camps is the lack of basic requirements: clean water, sanitation, food.
The meals were 3 times a day. There was rice in the morning, and rice at lunchtime, and rice at tea time. And there was no toilets.
Now utterly isolated, the men struggled to cling to a sort of life. They made friends, established routines, hoped desperately for release. Then, after 8 months, Alistair thought he'd got a lucky break.
I was told that I'd been put on a draft of 600 men to go to a holiday camp where the Japanese say that you will do 3 days work, 3 days rest, and good food.
His optimism lasted only as far as the train. The men were herded into cramped, airless rice trucks. It was a terrible shock.
Packed into these trucks, 30 or so to a truck, men ill with dysentery, dehydrated, sick, malaria.
Now in the Singapore heat, those steel-sided trucks, you couldn't touch the side. So there was nowhere you could sit. And then the doors were closed. I thought, what on earth is going to happen now?
What did happen was one of the most shameful episodes in this, or perhaps any other, war. Welcome to hell. Alistair Urquhart joined the Gordon Highlanders at 19. He spent his 22nd birthday in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, completely cut off from the world outside. Then, his captors promised him an easier life in what they described as a holiday camp. What followed was a train journey in a steel truck to Bampong in southwestern Thailand. The train was hot as a furnace, 30 to a carriage, no windows, no air, no light. 5 days and 5 nights went by before the ordeal came to an end.
To get out into the open air was an absolute heavenly relief. You kept breathing gulps of air rather than just breathing.
This welcome respite was short-lived, for then began what was to become a death march. The army of half-starved, dehydrated, diseased men was forced on foot through 160 kilometres of unforgiving jungle.
If they fell behind, the Japanese guards simply bayoneted those men that couldn't carry on.
As it was a column of 3 in this march, I made sure I was in the centre so the Japanese walking on either side couldn't really get at you.
Many fell on the trail. Some killed where they lay. Others left for the heat and the insects to finish them off. After another 5 days, they were told they had arrived at their destination.
Can you imagine what we found when we got to the holiday camp? It was just virgin jungle.
There was to be no rest and no shelter until they'd built it with their own bare hands.
Cut down trees, built huts. So we had to start cutting down bamboo trees. This is a holiday camp.
Alistair and the other POWs were to be slave labour on an impossible project. A railway running from Thailand to Burma through some of the most inhospitable territory on the planet.
If you look at the geography of the region, in order to go from, say, Thailand over to Burma, one of the few ways that you can do it would be to go through the Straits of Malacca. And that's exactly the place where Allied submarines are waiting for you. So it's absolutely critical to have a land route that can move mass amounts of freight very efficiently.
In all, some 330,000 men, including over 30,000 British POWs, were sent to work on the Burma Railway. The dense jungle wasn't the only obstacle.
Facing us was a huge wall of rock, probably 30 foot high. We had to go through that rock. And to do that, it was a hammer and tap and dynamite. It's unbelievable the weight we were expected to be able to lift. And if you did something bad, then you were made to stand in the sun with a huge boulder above your head. And every time you dropped that boulder, you got beaten up.
That they could work at all on the rations they were given defies understanding.
The amount of rice, if you take a mug, half of that was your ration, and the same amount of water. Now that was supposed to be 3 times a day.
But hunger makes a man resourceful.
There are accounts of sort of snail farms. Pets went into the cook pot if things were that bad. A lizard, anything they could find.
Muscle wasted, stamina declined.
Things seemed to get worse every day, and there was nothing to give you any hope whatsoever. Every morning, I used to say to myself, right, we'll survive today. Never thought of tomorrow.
Infection and disease took hold. Like many of the men, Alistair saw a small cut on his leg quickly turn into a painful tropical ulcer. Desperate for relief, he paid a visit to the camp doctor.
He said, well, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can really do for you, but I suggest you go to the latrines and get some maggots and put them on the ulcer, put a leaf around it, and let the maggots do their job. And I said, what will they do? He said, they will eat the rotten flesh until you come down to the good flesh. Well, fortunately, I still have 2 legs. Even today, I can sometimes feel, you know.
But maggots couldn't help everybody. Very occasionally, medical supplies from the Red Cross got through. Often they were confiscated by the Japanese. Medics among the prisoners learned to improvise.
They made out of bamboo all manner of physio and nursing equipment. Everything from bedpans to artificial limbs.
There's one example of an artificial limb made out of the remains of a crashed aeroplane.
The engineers in camps could convert cutlery into medical instruments. Forks and spoons were bent and shaped into surgical retractors for doing operations. Knives were sharpened and used as scalpels.
As soon as Alistair could walk again, the Japanese put him on a new project. He was to work on one of the infamous bridges over the River Kwai.
That bridge is part of kind of a jugular vein for that part of the empire. And once they've established that and are able to move large amounts of men and material into Burma, they can threaten the entire British Empire.
It was treacherous work. Weak, starving men balanced on slippery bamboo, high above the jungle canopy. Many died, but nobody forgot for a moment which side they were on.
At every opportunity, we sabotaged. I did specifically. And we used to get bolts to go through the log after you bought it. So if you had a chance, you had a wee steel saw hidden away, and you would cut part way through the bolt. So between that and what others were doing, when the first engine went across the bridge collapsed. It was a hilarious sight, but of course the whole camp and everybody connected with it got punished.
Torture was commonplace and inventive. One of the worst was a bamboo cage lowered into a pit and covered with corrugated iron. The Black Hole. It was a primitive oven, too small for a man to ease his limbs, just big enough for him slowly to roast. One evening, Alistair went to the latrine.
And on the way back, I encountered this Korean guard who, unfortunately, started to be rather sexual with me. And without really thinking, I kicked him in the spot that no man wants to be kicked in. And he fell screaming and howling to the ground. I thought, this is it. I've really done it now. And of course, the whole camp wakes up, Japanese flying all over the place, fixed bayonets, and I was dragged in front of the commanding officer's hut.
The next day, he found himself in the Black Hole.
My heart sank. I knew that most men kept in there, usually for 3 or 4 weeks, didn't come out alive. Darkness and the filth of the previous occupants engulfed me. I knelt and sobbed, falling in and out of consciousness. In the darkness, the sense of isolation was devastating. The next few days were the worst I had experienced on the railway, like a culmination of the extremes of temperature from the steel carriages on the way up to the railway, along with the death march and every other ounce of suffering endured since, all crammed into that tiny, back-breaking black hole. My degradation was complete.
Alistair survived 7 days and nights, but only just.
I used to think, well, you're not suffering now. Death was an absolute blessing, really, in the camp. Terrible to think at 20, 21, 22, that's the end of your life. But by that stage, we were losing men 12 a day.
The Japanese took 50,000 prisoners from the United Kingdom, soldiers, sailors and airmen, and of those 50,000, over 12,500 died in captivity. 25% of British prisoners from Great Britain. The percentage of British prisoners that died in German captivity and Italian captivity was only about 4%.
Perhaps the worst hardship of all for those in the camps was the feeling they were forgotten. In Britain, the war meant Europe. Singapore was an embarrassment. The Japanese best left to the Yanks. So for the men in the jungle, there were no letters from home, no fags or chocolate, no news, no hope.
A lot of the men, apart from being physically ill, became mentally ill. And one of the saddest things that one could ever imagine was the fact we had to build bamboo cages for them. And at night, you would hear the mumbling and rantings of these poor chaps. You know, death would have been a godsend for them. I've called on God a few times, I can tell you. Particularly when I was thinking about getting myself rid, committing suicide, as so many did.
There was, though, one moment of rare solace.
Some of the officers did try to improve the situation, and one of them was to have a concert on top of a hill. The part they were playing was Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. Now, they had no music. This actually was probably the first time I'd heard Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. And I was completely and utterly taken by the music. I didn't realise I was still a prisoner then. And for the whole of that evening, that was the way I felt, that the music was in me and it was the best medicine that I could possibly have.
The prisoners did anything they could to keep their spirits up. Some drew their impressions of camp life, hiding them for posterity in bamboo rolls in the ground. Others organised makeshift entertainments.
Theatrical performances were very important where they were able to put them on because they involved so many different people. So you'd have beautiful posters that were drawn to promote them, you'd have programmes, and everyone could either go and watch it or help to produce the sets and the costumes and be completely transported by it.
But while they played, a hidden enemy was gathering strength. The unsanitary conditions bred a new disease. Cholera swept through Alistair's camp. For Alistair, cholera was to bring about his release from the camp. But with that release came even greater danger. In 1943, Alistair Urquhart, a Japanese prisoner of war, was perilously ill. He'd survived incarceration, starvation, forced labour and torture. Yet still his adventures were far from over. His weight was down to 6 stone. Unable to work, he was sent to a hospital camp in Chung Kai, West Thailand. Having survived this far, he was not about to let a little thing like cholera get the better of him.
Knowing what can happen made me fight harder to live.
But no sooner had he recovered than he found himself crammed into a prison ship with 450 other men. As ever, he had no idea what was going on, but experience had taught him to fear the worst.
My thoughts were, this is an easy way of getting rid of us. They'll take us outside the harbour and they'll scuttle the ship.
The thing you need to remember about being a prisoner of war is it's not like being any other kind of prisoner. You don't know when your term's going to end. You know, it could go on for the rest of your life. They knew that the Japanese talked about fighting to the death, so they were still very fearful of how it might end, whether they would be killed as a sort of last revenge. So there was that anxiety always underlying everything.
But the plan wasn't to kill them, or not straight away. In the outside world, America had Japan on the back foot. Japan had called up all the men in their factories to fight, and they were shipping POWs over to replace them on what became known as hell ships.
Then came the worst 5 days one could ever imagine. It's difficult to describe how a human being can become an animal. The men were actually going mad. There was fights, there was real vicious animal fights, and I expect people were suffocated. You had no idea, it was pitch black. I never knew if it was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or even what month it was. I didn't care. I only cared about getting through that day.
Japanese shipping was no longer safe even in home waters. The Americans were coming and slowly taking control of the South China Seas. On the 11th of September 1944, Alistair's ship was spotted by an American submarine. The captain and crew had no idea who or what it carried. They just saw an enemy vessel.
There was a tremendous noise. It was a feeling we'd hit a mine or something. And within virtually seconds, the water started to pour in through the hold. And suddenly I found myself in the water, but in a flaming sea of oil. And I was naked, and I swam as hard as I could. There was men shouting, screaming, calling for their wives, calling for their children. And I just turned round and saw the ship go under the waves.
The ship sunk in just 15 minutes. That night, 244 of Alistair's comrades died. Victims, as they say, of friendly fire. And, of course, the sharks. In those waters, nobody survived for long. But by a miracle, Alistair found an abandoned life raft.
That was night. And I drifted and drifted, and when dawn came, I found myself alone, as far as I could see.
There followed his most extraordinary ordeal so far. Alistair drifted alone for days. Searing heat in the daytime, freezing cold at night. No food, no water, no sign of help.
The time came where I was drifting out of myself.
He stayed conscious and sane by bringing to mind his favourite songs.
It was the fact I could sort of play music in my head.
He went through his complete repertoire of pre-war quick steps, foxtrots and waltzes, but he always returned to his favourite.
Be sure it's true when you say I love you. It's a sin to tell a lie. Billions of hearts have been
Blind, burned and nearly dead, he was spotted by a passing ship. Some of the men were rescued by American ships. For them, the war was over. But Alistair's ship was Japanese. Once again, he found himself their prisoner.
How they got me off the raft onto the ship, I've no idea. And from that stage on, I've no idea how I got to Japan. I've no idea. I must have been in a very bad state.
On the 29th of September 1944, he was taken to a camp just outside a place then little known to the world, a town on Kyushu Island called Nagasaki. Compared to the jungle, it was paradise.
We had Japanese mat to lie on. Now that was a big change. We also had, for half an hour, some running water. But we didn't have any soap or toothbrush or anything. So even that was a little bit better.
As far as Alistair knew, a swastika could have been flying over Buckingham Palace. But after all his ordeals, this at least seemed like stability. It wasn't to last.
One day in August 45, I was tending to the tomato plants, which is a case of emptying the Japanese latrines and pouring the liquid onto the tomato plants, which I always remember was lovely and green. And while I was doing that, I heard the noise of a plane and could see quite clearly it was the American. And there was no opposition. So that gave me a real fillip. I thought, Americans are here. But suddenly, a hot gust, which I thought was a gale force wind, knocked me sideways. I had no idea what it was.
The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945. The second, 3 days later, on Nagasaki.
Some men described thinking that it was a local ammo dump that had gone up, and not having any idea until after the war was over and the troops came in to relieve the camps.
From then on, we didn't see any Japanese. They just disappeared.
The prisoners had no idea how devastating the bomb had been. 75,000 were killed instantly, and a further 75,000 injured.
It caused this immense loss of life. I think personally it saved Japanese lives as well, because had there been an invasion of the Japanese islands, the entire population was going to be mobilized to fight the they would have been principally American invaders, but perhaps with the British-Australian component as well, and it would have been a massacre.
Many are convinced that the bomb also saved the lives of Alistair and his fellow prisoners.
We know that the orders had been given by the Japanese military that all prisoners of war were to be exterminated in early September of 1945. That if the war hadn't ended when it did, I have no reason to doubt that that's exactly what would have happened.
Japan surrendered on the 14th of August 1945. But with no news to tell them it was all over, the POWs stayed put. They'd been hungry, beaten, diseased, and without hope for 3.5 years. Then the Americans came. At last, the prisoners were liberated.
It was a big cheer, and although we were piled up in ranks, it was just one holy rush. And whoever got on first was in the first truck or whatever. I managed to be on the first truck.
The drive from the camp to the port took them through the skeletal remains of a once bustling city.
I stared at the countryside out of the rear of the lorry. The hedgerows and trees now appeared to be dying. As we thundered on, the green of the hedgerows faded. Reddish-brown leaves turned brown, grey, and then black. Fairly soon, nothing was left. No birds sang, nothing lived. The truck kicked up great clouds of fine grey dust as it sped along. It looked more like the dark side of the moon. The words that rang out across the shattered ruins of Nagasaki were never sung with more conviction and passion. Rule Britannia. But I remained detached, unsure of what to think.
Alistair was taken to the port. He was alive. For 6 years, he'd been through experiences no human being should ever have to endure. Now, he was going home.
For me, it was unbelievable that we could be free. And then, when we actually started to sail, a terrible thought went through my mind. Suppose that a Japanese submarine doesn't know the war's finished. And that fear was always there on the journey home. The first night, the band on the ship played Sentimental Journey, a very apt tune, I would say. If I'd been a bit fitter, I might have gone on the deck and danced on my own. But unfortunately, I wasn't in that state to do it. But I had ears to listen.
For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to imagine arriving home, seeing loved ones, sharing their stories. But they were to be brought up short by one last cruel shock.
One of the things that was produced to us was a piece of paper agreeing to sign that we would not talk about our experiences, nor what we had seen in Nagasaki.
It was nothing less than a gagging order. Home came the heroes, and no one could be told. In 1945, Alistair Urquhart, after 6 years away, 3.5 of them a prisoner of the Japanese, was at last on his way home. But he and his fellow prisoners had been given strict instructions never to breathe a word of their ordeals to a living soul.
The Americans were very sensitive about any sort of information about the atomic weapon being circulated in the broader public. How could we be so barbaric as to wipe out women and children with this terrible weapon?
The truth of the matter was that both America and Britain colluded to do this because they wanted to trade with Japan and Russia. And we were the victims.
Coming back and telling lots of gruesome tales about the Japanese, it defeats the purpose of building strong relations between the United States and Japan. And I think this becomes even more important once China falls to the Communist Party, right? Then Japan becomes the sole bulwark against communism in the region. So that occupation, the rebuilding of Japan, the creation of a stable government, getting its economy back on track, were all critical to the United States and the regions.
After nearly 70 years, the sense of injustice still burns.
You felt really forgotten. We were the forgotten army.
After VE Day, the troops back from France and Germany were welcomed with full honours and street parties. Alistair expected a similar reception.
I assumed that there would be a welcome party, a band playing. Not such a thing. There was no one to welcome us.
In terms of popular culture, the war in Europe certainly dominated post-war years in terms of books, novels, films, and the war in Europe was a victory. The public didn't really have any feeling for what had happened out there.
Even the family reunion was a shock.
I was so glad to see the family, and I was shaken, really shaken, by the state of my mother and father. I'd forgotten the fact that I'd been away 6.5 years, but the strain up had been on them, not knowing whether I was alive or dead.
They took their son home for a celebratory meal, but he found too much had changed for him to simply pick up the threads of his former life.
All I wanted to do was to get outside. So I stood up and I said, I'm going out. We'll come with you. I said, no, I want to be on my own. Which was probably very hurtful to them, but that's what I needed.
I just wanted to be on my own. I had lived a solitary life for so long that love only suffocated me. In many respects, my family felt like strangers. They could never comprehend the depths of man's inhumanity to man, or the awfulness of an existence that consisted of surviving one day at a time.
When I was walking, I was continually looking back. Must have been the fact that I thought the Japanese was behind me. And to be honest, I was scared I would be.
Eventually, he found a sort of peace. He met a woman called Mary, and soon they were married. But in the 46 years between their marriage and her death, he never once mentioned his wartime experiences.
From that time on, she knew I'd been a Japanese prisoner of war, but we never talked about it. And strangely enough, she never asked questions about it.
But nearing the end of his life, he decided somebody should bear witness to the sacrifice that he and his comrades had made. He would tell one person, his son. Unable to find the words face to face, he put it in writing.
The worst bit of reading it was the understanding of how close to death he must have been for all these years, and how strong-willed he must have been to survive. Because, you know, I try and put myself into his shoes, and I probably reckon I probably would have lasted just a few weeks and given up.
Most of us would probably feel the same. And the death toll amongst the Japanese prisoners of war was astonishing. Over 13,000 died in captivity. But Alistair has a simple explanation for his exceptional tale.
I often wonder now, how did I survive? I think when I was a youth, if I took up anything at all, I had to be the best, or at least try to be the best in that particular thing. And I've always been wanting to be a winner. I think, truthfully, that I made my own luck.